and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a set of virtual discussions, at least for now, on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. This afternoon, I'm truly honored and pleased to host Beth Sanner for a discussion of the intelligence community, Putin, and the crisis in Ukraine. Beth has had a long and very distinguished career in the intelligence agency. Most recently is the Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Mission Integration. And in this role, she served as former President Trump's PDB, President's Daily Briefer, from April 2019 to December 2020. Beth, let me welcome you to Carnegie Connect. You played so many roles in the intelligence community over such an extended period of time that I can't think of anybody better to talk to us about the process of intelligence, foreign policy, and of course, Ukraine. And I'm doubly pleased, I guess, as a former INR intelligence analyst way back in the day. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So I know we want to talk Ukraine, but before we do, I wanted to ask you a couple questions about the process of intelligence. You also served as the director of the career training program for CIA analysts, I believe. So let me ask you, what do you think it takes and or what makes a really good intelligence analyst?
Well, thanks for having me. I think it's really important to have people who were inside the intelligence community come and talk to people about what it is all about. I think we need to have a little bit more transparency, as D&I Haynes has recently talked about. So I'm happy to be here. So I was in charge of the Career Analyst Program, which is the training program for all new analysts at CIA. And it was one of the best jobs I had. It was super fun. When I'm looking at people and thinking about hiring when I was in those positions, there are good analysts and there are great analysts. A good analyst can take a problem and break it down and think about a framework for how do I intellectually tackle this problem set? What am I looking for? But a great analyst is someone who not only can go deep on any topic, but is also intellectually curious, well-read, broad, thinks about the world, thinks about connections, and also can articulate ideas both on paper and in person. And, so I think, increasingly we also need to have people who are digitally literate, who can do the kind of data research that needs to be done. But I think most of it is about mindset.
I mean, there's intuitive skills to being an analyst. I mean, in the classified world, you're bombarded with more information than you could probably ever assimilate or process. And part of it is deciding what's important and what isn't important. Is failure, I'm intrigued by this because we were accused of it, the United States, in the wake of 9/11, the failure to imagine, the failure of imagination in intelligence, the notion that if in fact you can't imagine something happening that's so out of the box, or if you can, then you reason backward and try to figure out why it happened. And in doing that, in imagining, you may actually prepare yourself and intuit things that might actually take place.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that intelligence failure generally comes from that failure of imagination, as the 9/11 Commission identified. Iraq WMD was the same issue. I think, it was a combination of poor intelligence, deceptive intelligence, and then the analysts' inability to question their assumptions and really think critically about how things had changed. They carried over analysis, and then they didn't talk about, the quality of that analysis that, if you asked them at the time, they probably would have said, oh, I have a low confidence that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. So a lot of that has changed in how the intelligence community thinks about problem sets. Since 9/11 and Iraq WMD, there have been a lot of lessons learned about showing your homework, about applying rigorous tradecraft, about thinking through how could I be wrong. And, so you have national intelligence officers literally writing things about, this is what we think, but how could we be wrong? And imagining that with the community. So I think you've got it exactly right. I mean, that's the essence of avoiding failure is testing and thinking about that. But you also have to have a diversity of opinion. We have the paradox of expertise. You have to have people from other disciplines or other areas questioning what you're doing, and saying like, well, I don't know, if I sit from here, this movie looks like it's going to turn out differently than you say.
Right.
And, so I think those kinds of dialogues are important.
Does the bureaucracy the clearance process bureaucracy lend itself to analysts who are prepared to push the envelope? I remember when I was at INR writing assessments, this is way back in the 80s, on our unhappy experience in Lebanon. And my colleagues at the agency were stunned that I was able to say these things and get them cleared. Is there still that problem of too many clearances that undermine the freshness and pushing the envelope for an analyst who may not have everything at his or her disposal to prove something, but the analysis is worth reading anyway?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things to unpack there. There is a problem with there's a pro and a con of intelligence community coordination. So for any PDB or any National Intelligence Council report, and National Intelligence Council is like the internal think tank of the intelligence community, those are all intelligence community coordinated. And that means the analysts who have expertise on those issues are looking at the pros and saying they agree or they disagree with this part of it or whatever. And so that's great for the most part, but it also can lead to least common denominator answers, which is, I think, partly what you're saying there, right? That you can dull down judgments, and there is a big problem with, I think, that dulling down. And so there still is a very strong role, I think, for individual agencies, and also for individual agencies to create things like the red cell. There are vehicles for people to express things that are outside of the norm, but I think we really need to reinvigorate and keep those things going because it's so important.
Let's turn now to one of the key roles, fascinating roles you played. You briefed presidents, but you were former President Trump's principal intelligence briefer between April 2019 and December of 2020. First, before you take us inside the room, if you can, tell us a little bit about the President's Daily Brief, this mysterious PDB.
Right. So I was the head of the PDB for 2 years before I became the briefer in my last role as the deputy DNI. So that gave me a great perspective too, from just how is the sausage made. And the PDB, people think of it as we call it the book, which is a handful of articles that are produced every day, length depending on kind of current events. It's like the classified newspaper. Sometimes you have more strategic things, sometimes you have shorter things that are more tactical, but the PDB is much more than the book. It really is the relationship between the principal, which is the president, and all the cabinet and sub-cabinet national security folks in the administration and their briefers. And there are, a dozen or so of these briefers who go every day around town and sit with their principal generally and talk about what's in the PDB. And each of those people is also curating the material in addition to this PDB. So the PDB is this level set that everybody across the administration is getting. Then you have additional material that may be from individual agencies. It could be open source. It could be, some overhead imagery. And these are curated for that person's day and agenda and interests.
Right. And when that person happens to be the president of the United States, or in this case, when that person happened to be Donald Trump, you need to know your client. You need to know your audience. And I'm told you were extremely good at knowing your audience. So take us into the room. I mean, I imagine maybe my own personal views are getting in the way here, of conspiracy theories, attacks on the intelligence community, rants, distractions. I don't want to read anything. Why is this important? Why are you even telling me this? So what was it like?
It wasn't like that for me, not very much. I mean, I think that, I was in the Oval Office a couple times a week for very significant amounts of time. When you look at a president's schedule that's divided in 5-minute increments to have a half an hour to an hour and sometimes going over, we spend a lot of time. And, I had pages and pages of things that I was conveying, and we had conversations. So I did, most of the talking, and I think that, in fact, it was very different than the caricature that you kind of get from people who weren't there. At least, during my time, I didn't sit in on anybody else's sessions. Um, but, a lot of things had happened. The room was very small. We didn't have a lot of people there. And so I think that probably the tenor of those conversations changed over time from the beginning of the administration to the end of administration, based on how the chief of staff wanted those sessions to go.
But you personally, I think, and I'm just repeating what was in the New York Times, were I don't know whether you were personally attacked, were the briefer in at least two instances. You know what they are. One is the COVID briefing, in which I gather the former president claimed that he had been underbriefed on the issue of how severe COVID-19 was. And the other one, I guess, was the Russian bounty question. You were obviously under a lot of pressure in both of those episodes. And it raises, I guess, the question of how do you deal with a president who may say, I'm not interested in that, or what about this, when in fact based on your own analysis, what the situation is, and you're being contradicted or ignored. That's a problem, I'm assuming.
Well, I judge success on maybe a different wavelength than, what the American voter would base it on, right? So
Right.
my judgment of my success is not what is the policy of the president. That is not my job. My job is to convey the information that the intelligence community has provided in a way that is complete and has integrity and, is consistent and well done. So that was my job. So, there were days that I knew that maybe I would be talking about some things that he might disagree with, because he'd been very transparent about those things. And you just put your big boy pants on and you go to work and you do what you're supposed to do. And I think, also, I think that part of my mentality was that I am not a person who, I believe in the concept of truth to power, but I don't believe that the intelligence community always owns the truth, because truth is something that's factual. And most of what we do are our assessments. And so it's possible that we're wrong, and we have been wrong. And I think I went into each briefing with some humility, but at the same time, I knew, what our confidence level was on different things. And sometimes I would simply ask, why he had a different opinion. Or I would know, and I would say, well, this is what the intelligence community thinks. This is what the evidence is. And I think if you approach people in that way, with a lot of transparency, with not a lot of arrogance, with listening, I always say you have to listen to be heard, then you're more likely to have a conversation, even if at the end of the day you have to say, well, we're going to have to agree to disagree.
Right.
But I think that I just try to be forthright. And I do think that most people appreciate that, you're not trying to pull punches, you're not trying to pull a fast one, you're not trying to make them look stupid or, anything. You're just trying to be helpful. And I felt that the American people um, would want me to try to provide as much information as clearly as possible.
Right. You know, curiosity is a critically important, in my judgment, characteristic in life. It's clearly very important for presidents. You have to know what you don't know, and you have to be in a hurry to find out. And I think that means you have to be open to processing information, whether it validates your particular policy or whether it doesn't. And I suspect the curiosity factor varies, right, from president to president. You have had experience of briefing other presidents other than former President Trump, correct?
Yeah, I have.
And
Yeah,
and I mean, you have to know your constituent or your client.
right.
Are there different ways to convey information? Some read, some want to be orally brief, some like photos.
Right. Exactly. I think that educators today, when they go to college, learn all different ways of communicating to students based on what their learning styles are. That is something that, as a person serving a president, if you're not paying attention to how they absorb information, then you're not doing your job. And so, the briefings I had, and my predecessor with President Trump, were all oral and then supplemented by a lot of maps and graphs and charts because I figured as a businessman, he, was very interested in economics and GDP and trade and charts about things like that. It was something that he enjoyed and got a lot out of. Most presidents are very interested in people because most presidents are politicians, and so they think a lot about people. And so for many presidents that I've dealt with, they really want to understand who it is that I'm going to be sitting across from. And so providing leadership and understanding of who these leaders are is something that always seems to be very useful to people. But for me, I did use visuals a lot more than probably any briefer before or since. And I found that it was a way of anchoring the briefing and having something that we were really focused on and talking about, and lots of creative ways of doing that. And frankly, I really resented some of the chatter about how that was dumbing down the intelligence. I didn't feel that that visuals, a picture tells 1,000 words. I believe in that, and so I'm a visual learner too. I love reading books, but I'm a visual
Right.
learner, so I didn't find it that weird. I found it really useful.
Now, I can understand now how you survived 2 years, because it would have taken, I think, someone with incredible emotional intelligence to do that job. Let's turn to Ukraine now. I wanted to focus on Putin precisely because of the challenge he probably does pose to the intelligence community. Forget the collection aspect, unless you have thoughts on that that you can share. But I want to focus on the analysis. And I want to use as a point of departure, the late British historian John Keegan once argued that 6 men were responsible for most of the death, destruction, devastation, as well as prospects for peace and prosperity of much of the Western world in the second half of the 20th century. He identifies Lenin, Mao Zedong, Hitler, Stalin, Churchill, and FDR. We've rarely faced a situation, maybe Saddam Hussein, since the 30s or 40s, where one man has kept the world on the edge of its collective seat for almost a month now. One man whose motivations, sensibilities, analysis, objectives are not always easy to read. I wonder if you convene the top 25 Russian analysts in Washington on February 1st and ask them for a yes or no answer to this question. will Putin mount a comprehensive, however inept it's proving to be, invasion of Ukraine? I would bet the answer would be, among most, would be no. So, or maybe you disagree. Maybe.
Why do you say that when the intelligence community has been saying that this was going to happen all along?
Right. But at the same time, as you know, they've been saying we don't think President Putin has made a judgment as to whether or not, and they said that right up to the last minute.
True.
Which I'm not being critical.
No. I'm not taking it that way because, I mean, I will just say that one of the reasons is because knowing that intent of a leader that's the golden ticket, right? That how do you get inside someone's head?
Exactly.
Very difficult.
I mean, the imagery in the overhead will tell you where moving the tanks around and where they're going. So clearly, as early as November, when Bill Burns was in Moscow warning Putin, this was up. The question is, would he actually go through with it?
Yeah.
And most of them I talked to were surprised. So I guess I'd ask.
That is so interesting.
No, I don't know. Maybe
I was advising people for some time that it was going to happen.
That the invasion was going to happen.
Yes, and it wasn't going to be limited to the Donbass.
Okay, so on what basis did you make that judgment or that assessment?
Yeah, so I don't have the inside track to, be reading the intelligence. I made that based on what Putin's stated goals were. He was very clear about what is it that he could tolerate and not tolerate. And then looking at the various options of how he thought he could get that. And I thought that there was a small possibility that he might try a negotiated settlement based on Minsk. But I also knew that there was about zero chance that he was going to get out of that in any short time frame what he was looking for. And so it seemed obvious to me that even though it was, I worried about saying that because it seemed so unthinkable. My gut was telling me that it was going to happen. And I think one of the real challenges for analysts is not to mirror image. Mm-hmm. And I was saying this last night at a dinner that, I think we all tend to mirror image, right? It's that how can you imagine that somebody would do something so unspeakable? And Fiona Hill recently wrote a piece that was, can you remember what it was? It was like, it was about, yes, he'll do it. You think he won't do it, yes, he will. Something like that. And because you look at what he has done and you know that there are no guardrails that would prevent this from happening. It was basically a strategic cost-benefit analysis.
Right. There are no guardrails, certainly for an authoritarian. Well, there may be some, but you're right.
And no moral guardrails.
Right. A unitary actor. But in looking at human behavior, and this is where I guess these are analytical traps, but looking at human behavior, if I studied Beth Sanner for a year and I was asked to make a judgment on what Beth Sanner would do, I would look to her previous behavior to try to make a judgment and assessment. If you looked at Putin, the way Putin acted, as well, not just what he said, what you would have seen, I think, I'm no Russian specialist, but you would have seen a series of incremental moves which were characterized by a fair amount of risk aversion. You would have seen 2008 in Georgia. You would have seen 2014 in Crimea and the Donbass, even Syria, which was, a vital national interest for Russia, proved to be a success, limited involvement for maximum return. So that might have led you to conclude that Putin would do what he had been doing all along, maybe on a little larger scale, the Donbass, for example. But to go beyond that required either a misreading of what Putin had been doing or a set of factors that changed
Yes.
Putin's circumstances.
Yes.
COVID, isolation.
Changed,
I
not just
don't know what.
circumstances. It's not just so when a leader's thinking about what to do, he's also thinking about what is the cost of me doing that. And I think that this misjudgment about what the cost would be, his judgment was at the time, and it's clear from the treatise that he wrote in July and what he's been saying since 2008, that his view of Ukraine was what he's trying to accomplish, and his view of where Ukraine was going also had shifted. When Zelensky came in, he thought that that Zelensky could be controlled. It was a Russian speaker from the East, did not expect Ukraine to be moving even further west. And so you look as Putin out at the world and you say, when I want to accomplish this, this is important for Russian security. This is vital for Russian security. How can I get this done? And a lot of that is when to get it done. Merkel's out, US divided, the war chest I've been building up. I'm isolating myself. So insulating myself from sanctions. The Europeans are going to split. I've been investing in Hungary and Czech President Zeman. I've got Xi to back me up. Now or never.
Right. So the assessments he made led him to the conclusion that a big move, which would break precedent, with what he had done before, was the right move for him to make. There was no other set of factors that would have influenced. The media, much of it talks about Putin's isolation, the long table, COVID. Does any of that play into the analysis and into the calculation?
So I think the way it plays in is maybe different than what a lot of people are talking about, is that all that has made him irrational. I am not in that camp. I think all of that made him make bad decisions. It may have made him more emotional. It may have, given him a sense of mortality, may have affected his timeline in that way. I don't think it made him irrational, but I think it absolutely made the information that was getting to him, that convinced him that this would work, either non-existent or extremely bad.
I mean, I guess you could argue in reverse in a way that he made a judgment, some would argue as early as 2004, 2007 in Munich, that reconstituting part of what was the former Soviet Union was his objective. It would occur during his political life, perhaps as President Xi has made a judgment that reunification with Taiwan will occur within my quote unquote political life, and that circumstances simply appeared to him to be right for a move.
I think that Putin sees himself as this historic figure. He is being pumped up by, the Orthodox Church in trying to renew this, old Russia. And that there is this place for, Christian Russia in history that he is destined to restore. And when you're alone and you're an autocrat, things can kind of get out of control.
Right. So based on everything we've talked about, if you had your 2 or 3 minutes with President Biden, not at the beginning of the crisis, we're in who knows whether we're in midstream or where we are in terms of the temporal aspects of this, what would you tell the president? What would your assessment of Putin be? and perhaps more important, something that I'm sure you didn't do when you were inside, what kinds of assumptions about U.S. actions would you convey to the president? In other words, how does Putin's his moves, his mood, his sensibilities, what does the president need to know in terms of U.S. policy and actions going forward based on what you know about Putin?
Well, I think that this idea of identifying assumptions that underlie your policy options are really important, and some administrations have literally gone through very formal processes of identifying assumptions and asking the intelligence community to look at those assumptions and make a judgment about whether they are correct or not. So I do think that, and I know that I'm sure, I don't know, but I'm sure the intelligence community is thinking about some of our assumptions. You know, one of the clear assumptions that we've made for a long time is that Russia does not want to have a nuclear war with the United States. You got to be constantly testing that assumption and defining it and redefining it. What does that mean? Because a lot of the policy options hinge on where is it that Putin is going to feel that he is at war with us. And as someone recently said to me, that his idea of whether he's at war with us may be different than our definition of that. He may see that we are at war, feel that we are at war before we interpret our actions in that way. So I think that absolutely a key to this is understanding as much as you can about how Putin is viewing these different actions, because you know, the next steps absolutely depend on it. I would also say that a key role is to look beyond, you know, the tactical. What happens in crises, and I saw this in Balkans and Afghanistan and all sorts of places, no matter where I was sitting at the time, the very most senior policymakers will start getting pulled into very minute tactical things. And it's very important for the intelligence community, parts of it, who aren't engaged in the tactical, to be pulling back and really talking about what are the third order effects? What are the long-term implications of different policy options? How will allies and adversaries see these views, these moves over the long term? And you really have to try to get as much of that in as possible in the extremely busy days that they are in right now.
I mean, based on what you know then, that Putin is doubling down, he's not backing down. He's an autocrat. I think you were quoted in the Times the other day as saying that Putin has no choice to double down. Autocrats can't walk away and look weak. Now, if that's an assessment, then raising the stakes, the U.S. raised the stakes. Let's just identify an idea that's been tossed around a lot lately, which is the notion of a no-fly zone. You would, I guess, argue for caution on the part of a president, because you don't know, if your assessment that we don't know when Putin feels that he is truly at war with the United States and the objective of the Americans is to bring him down, which I mean, he may have already concluded, then steps that could trigger an escalatory cycle and lead to they're no longer unimaginable. Mm-hmm. We hear them every day, the deployment of a tactical nuclear weapon or a demonstration of a nuclear weapon is now on the table in terms of serious analysts. I mean, I heard you on with James Clapper, and that issue came up. Mm-hmm. So thinking things through, and I mean, is risk aversion based on the intelligence and everything you know? Careful, deliberate, and it is risk aversion. We are risk averse. because we have taken off the table
Yeah.
any notion of American military involvement. And we may find ourselves with a problem in terms of supply lines.
Yes,
In
very
terms
much.
of, right, in terms of getting stuff to the Ukrainian military as this Russian military operation advances. So is that what you mean by thinking things through?
Yeah, in part. One of the good things about being an intelligence officer, it's so much easier than being the policymaker. I mean, I stood in the shoes of that policymaking position, and you have the weight of the world on you. The intelligence community, certainly when I was in those roles, I mean, you feel all of that weight of the world on you too, because you care so much about informing as much as you can, but not influencing. So I am not at this stage of my career, I'm not used to having to be on that, recommendation side of things because I tried so hard not to be for so long. But thinking it through is, what are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to avoid? What actions are you thinking about? And then I will talk to you about, okay, if you're going for X and you do Y, is that likely to get you there? And if so, what are some of the second and third order effects that you may not have thought about, even if you achieve that? Short term, long term. So, the role of the intelligence community is help think through, okay, so what are some of the things that could happen if Poland decides to start sending MiGs in?
Right.
Right. And what does that look like? And so being part of those conversations in the situation room, where then the military says, and this is what we would do in response. And then the intelligence community said, well, we would expect then the Russians to do X. So that's part of that, conversation at very senior levels about, how our adversary will react and act. And again, trying to think beyond our noses about the first reaction. But I
One,
am worried about that escalation, but I'm also worried about being too cautious.
I mean, again, I suspect listening to all the chatter and reading serious analysts, the prevailing wisdom appears to be that maybe based on poor Russian morale, no sense of coordination between ground and air, logistical problems, that the Russian military is not what anyone thought it would be, that the Russians are bogged down, that they will not accomplish what it is they set out to do. And at some point, Putin, the opportunist, will realize that a pivot is required. Now, I don't trust that judgment based on my unprofessional look. That I was one of those who concluded that Putin would not do what he did.
Mm-hmm.
And if that is the judgment of the intelligence community, that we're talking about perhaps a Russian occupation, grinding, can't control the major cities. There's going to be an insurgency. This is going to be Afghanistan. Internal protests in Russia are going to mount. The economic sanctions will squeeze him. And we are at a major inflection point. And time is not on Putin's side. Time is not on his side. I mean, that's a sort of, if that's the judgment they've reached, that worries me.
Well, I don't know what judgment they've reached that isn't already in the press. I didn't get a chance to watch the entire threat hearing today.
Right.
But my expectation is that this is going to grind on for at least a couple more weeks, if not a little bit longer. But there will be a point where Putin will realize that he cannot accomplish his plan for having a regime in Kyiv that he can control, that he cannot have a vassal state because he can't occupy the country. So, I mean, at some point, there will be some sort of pivot, there will be some sort of negotiation. And I just think that really is the only thing I can see as an option because there is no military solution.
That's a judgment. I mean, that's a very firm judgment. That you should know is the national threat assessment that is out. Is that what it is? That the headline, the Chiron I read on CNN was that Putin does not desire a confrontation with the United States.
I'm still on track.
All right, can we just a couple more questions? We're running out of time. I wanted to just briefly talk to you about transparency. Can you recall any other time in your experience in the intelligence community where so much information was put out in an effort clearly to deter, maybe to buy time, about Putin's intentions and how this might play out? Is there any precedent for this?
Well, the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? But it wasn't. Yeah, I mean, there wasn't as much,
Right.
but there was a lot. And I was in charge of the declassification process for the 2016-2017 intelligence assessment on Russian election influence. And there was a lot of intelligence that was put out at that time. But this has certainly been broader and more significant than anything we've ever seen in the history. And I think it's been it's been good. Of course, I worry about the implications of, are we going to lose our sources right at the moment where we need them the most? And I have no idea whether we already have or not. But of course, I think it accomplished three things. The first is it probably totally freaked the Russian security services out, which meant that they have clamped down. And there's no doubt, like, that's what anybody would do, right? Where's that leak coming from?
Yeah,
Shut it down, right?
Exactly.
And the second thing is it really, I think, made it a lot harder for Putin to pick these options that we were exposing. And third, I really feel that for the entire United States and for the global community, Putin has had to own the blood in the streets that we're seeing now. There is no denying who's responsible unless you live in Russia. So, I think it's been very, very positive.
Last question, Beth. You're paid to worry for a living. Intelligence analysts deal in probabilities, diplomats deal in possibilities.
Yes.
But I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you what keeps Beth Sanner up at night with respect to this crisis or in general.
Well, I think two things. One is the United States' role in the world over the long term and whether we will be able to compete, be competitive as a country with economic and military and political strength in the face of Russian and in face of Chinese and now, really unexpected in some ways, Russian aggression and all the fallout from that. But the other point that I really worry about is about what's going on in America and how that relates to that. I think that we need more bipartisan support on foreign policy and the ability to have negotiations. At some point, we need the ability to talk to Russia about European security. We need the ability to talk to Russia and China about arms control. And just because there are adversaries doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk to them. We need in this country the ability of any administration of any stripe to be able to have negotiations and conversations. And we need to be less isolationist.
Yeah.
Allies matter. We've learned that in the last 2 weeks.
Right. Beth, let me thank you for sharing the richness of and varied experiences that you've had in the intelligence community. You've made me a lot smarter, and I'm sure that I can speak for the Carnegie Connect's viewers. And to Carnegie Connect viewers, in the chat, there's a link to an amazing interview with Ken Burns that we did yesterday. It's clearly a must-watch. So until next time, and Beth, thanks again, truly. You were great.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.